You can't just waltz in here and dictate our security policies. Councilwoman Patricia Hayes slammed her palm against the mahogany table, her face flushed with indignation. This is a residential neighborhood, not some fortress. David Chen remained seated, his fingers steepled as he watched the heated exchange unfold in the community center's main hall. 3 months ago, he'd been the neighborhood's silent guardian, the tech entrepreneur who'd quietly funded and installed state-of-the-art security gates at every entrance to Willowbrook Estates. Now he was their scapegoat, blamed for everything from decreased property values to the recent spike in break-ins that had terrorized families for weeks. Crime dropped 67% in the first quarter after installation. At what cost? Hayes shot back. Emergency services complained about response times. Delivery drivers got lost. The twist that would eventually unravel everything sat in David's laptop bags. Footage from his personal security system that captured the real reason behind the burglaries. But as he watched the crowd of angry residents, many of whom had once waved to him during morning jogs, David realized that Hayes' crusade against his security measures wasn't just about community access. Her brother-in-law's locksmith business had been hemorrhaging money since the professional-grade security made break-ins nearly impossible. The same woman who demanded the gates be removed had been receiving monthly payments from someone who profited from the neighborhood's vulnerability. The confrontation would escalate into a battle for the soul of Willowbrook Estates. Reputation as a paranoid recluse would be weaponized against him. Residents would turn on their protector. The media would paint him as a control freak, and the real criminals would use the chaos to their advantage. Threats often came from within, and the people screaming loudest about safety were sometimes the ones sabotaging it. As Hayes continued her tirade, David noticed Police Captain Rodriguez shift uncomfortably in his chair. The same officer who'd initially praised the security system's effectiveness now seemed eager to distance himself from it. Burglary occurred after the gates were removed. The captain's request had seemed routine then, but now David wondered if Rodriguez's discomfort stemmed from something more than community pressure. Mr. Chen's vigilante approach to security has created more problems than it solved, Hayes declared, gesturing to the crowd. The gates made our neighborhood look like we didn't trust our own police force. David's jaw tightened, had identified patterns, tracked suspicious vehicles, and even helped recover stolen property. But none of that mattered now that public opinion had turned against him. The neighborhood's golden boy had become its pariah, and the real criminals were capitalizing on the chaos. The meeting would end with a vote to permanently. He had evidence that would expose the corruption, recordings that would vindicate his methods, and a plan that would reveal how the same people demanding his removal had orchestrated the crime wave that followed. The question wasn't whether he could prove his innocence, it was whether the community would listen before it. It was too late. The vote was unanimous, 47-0 against David Chen's security measures. Not a single person in the packed community center had defended him. As residents filed out, their conversations buzzed with relief and vindication. Finally, they'd taken back their neighborhood from the paranoid tech mogul who'd turned their peaceful streets into a surveillance state. David remained in his seat, watching the exodus with calculated patience. Hayes approached him with a victorious smile, her earlier anger replaced by smug satisfaction. "I hope you understand this isn't personal," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. David's response was measured, but his eyes held a dangerous glint. "Or have you simply silenced the voices that might have asked uncomfortable questions?" Hayes' smile faltered slightly. "Business has tripled its revenue since the gates came down. Curious timing, don't you think?" The color drained from Hayes' face. That's completely unrelated. Marcus runs a legitimate business. I'm sure he does. Just like I'm sure it's coincidence that every house that's been burglarized in the past 3 weeks had their locks changed by reliable security solutions within the last 6 months. Hayes stepped back, her political composure cracking. "You're grasping at straws, Chen. People are tired of living in fear." "Fear? My fear?" David stood slowly, his presence suddenly more imposing. "Let me tell you about fear, Patricia. Fear is Mrs. Rodriguez on Oak Street, 73 years old, calling me at 2 in the morning because someone's trying to break into her house. That the security system that could have prevented all of this is sitting in my warehouse, collecting dust because you convinced everyone that safety was somehow oppression. Captain Rodriguez, who'd been lingering near the exit, suddenly found himself drawn back into the conversation. Mr. Chen, I think you're getting a bit carried away here. The security gates were causing legitimate problems. Were they? Captain David's attention shifted to the officer. Emergency services had priority access codes. The only problems were the ones manufactured by people who had something to gain from their removal. Rodriguez's hand moved unconsciously to his radio, a nervous habit David had observed during their previous interactions. I resent the implication. I'm not implying anything, Captain. I'm telling you that when you asked me to disable the cameras on Elm Street 3 weeks ago, I kept recordings of everything, including the license plate of the vehicle that cased the Morrison house 2 days before it was burglarized. The silence that followed was deafening. Hayes and Rodriguez exchanged a look that lasted just a moment too long, the kind of glance that spoke. Accusations without evidence. Who said anything about accusations? David's smile was razor-sharp. Dime. Simply sharing observations. For instance, I've observed that crime statistics have a funny way of disappearing when they don't support the narrative. I've observed that certain patrol routes seem to avoid the areas where my cameras used to operate, and I've observed that people who profit from chaos tend to be the loudest voices calling for the removal of systems that prevent it. Hayes recovered first, her political instincts kicking in. This is harassment, plain and simple. David reached into his laptop bag and pulled out a tablet. Is that what we're calling pattern recognition now? Because I've got 3 months of data showing exactly who benefits from Willowbrook's crime wave. Names, dates, financial records, all perfectly legal to obtain through public information requests and commercial databases. Rodriguez's radio crackled, and David noticed the captain's relief at the interruption. Rodriguez here. Captain, we've got another break-in on Maple Street. Looks like the same MO as the others. That made both Hayes and Rodriguez uncomfortable. Maple Street? That's the 3rd house this month, with locks installed by Reliable Security Solutions. But I'm sure that's just another coincidence. As Rodriguez hurried away to respond to the call, Hayes made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. Your paranoia is destroying this community, Chen. People just want to feel safe in their own homes. Then they should have kept the security gates, David replied, packing his tablet away, because what's coming next is going to make the past 3 weeks look like a warm-up. David's home office looked like a command center for a military operation. Multiple monitors displayed real-time feeds from his remaining private cameras, financial records, police reports, and a detailed timeline of every crime that had occurred in Willowbrook Estates. Since the security gates were removed, sleep had become a luxury he couldn't afford not to, and every night brought new victims and fresh evidence of the systematic dismantling of his neighborhood's safety. The doorbell rang at 6:47 a.m., interrupting his analysis of the previous night's break-in. Through his security monitor, David recognized Detective Sarah Martinez, Rodriguez's partner, who'd always seemed more interested in solving crimes than playing politics. Detective Martinez, David said, opening the door before she could knock. I assume you're here about the Maple Street incident. Martinez stepped inside, her expression unreadable. Among other things, we need to talk, Mr. Chen. I hope you're ready for a long conversation. David led her to his office, where the wall of monitors cast an eerie glow over stacks of printed reports and photographs. Because what I'm about to show you is going to change everything you think you know about the crime wave in Willowbrook. Martinez surveyed the setup with professional interest. Impressive. But before we dive into your theories, I need to ask you something directly. Are you conducting your own investigation into these burglaries? I'm analyzing publicly available data and my own security footage. Is that illegal? No, but it might be dangerous. Martinez moved closer to the monitors. Because someone's been asking questions about you? Someone with enough influence to make my captain very nervous. David's hands paused over his keyboard. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest you're not just a concerned citizen with expensive toys? The kind that made me run your background through federal databases. Martinez turned to face him directly. So imagine my surprise when I discovered that David Chen isn't just a tech entrepreneur. He's a former NSA contractor who specialized in pattern recognition and surveillance countermeasures. The silence stretched between them for several heartbeats. David had spent years crafting his public persona as a successful but unremarkable businessman. The truth was far more complicated. That's in the past, David said finally. Is it? Because the same skills that made you valuable to the intelligence community are exactly what someone would need to uncover the kind of conspiracy you're suggesting exists in Willowbrook. David pulled up a new window on his central monitor. Detective Martinez, what I'm about to show you is 3 months of surveillance data, financial records, and communication patterns. I've identified a network of at least 12 individuals who have systematically orchestrated the removal of security measures in this neighborhood for profit. 12 people. That's Councilwoman Hayes, whose brother-in-law's locksmith business has seen a 340% increase in revenue since the gates came down. Captain Rodriguez, who's been redirecting patrol routes away from areas where my cameras used to operate. City Planning Director Walsh, who fast-tracked the permit to remove the security gates despite normally requiring a 90-day review period. And 9 others, all connected through financial relationships, family ties, or mutual business interests. Martinez leaned forward, studying the data. This is ... extensive. But correlation isn't causation, Mr. Chen. You're talking about a conspiracy that would require coordination across multiple city departments. I'm talking about opportunism, detective people who saw a chance to profit from manufactured crisis and took it. David clicked to another screen showing a timeline. Look at this sequence. The first complaint about the security gates came from a resident whose house was scheduled for foreclosure. 2 days later, that same resident received a cash payment. From a company owned by Hayes' brother-in-law, the foreclosure was mysteriously delayed. That could be coincidence. Like the fact that every house that's been burglarized had their locks changed by reliable security solutions within the past 8 months. Or that the insurance adjuster handling all the claims just happens to be Rodriguez's cousin, Martinez. It was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the implications. Why are you showing me this? Why not take it to the FBI or state police? Because I tried that route once before, Detective, 5 years ago, when I was still working for the government. I uncovered a similar pattern of corruption in a defense contract. I followed protocol, reported it through proper channels, and watched as the investigation was buried and the whistleblowers were transferred to dead-end assignments. So you decided to handle it yourself this time. I decided to gather irrefutable evidence first, evidence that couldn't be dismissed or suppressed. David pulled up another screen showing financial transfers. But I need someone inside the system, someone who can act on this information without it disappearing into bureaucratic limbo. Martinez studied the data for several minutes, her expression growing more troubled with each revelation. Mr. Chen, if even half of this is accurate, we're talking about charges that could destroy careers and send people to prison. You're sure about these connections? I'm sure enough to stake my reputation on it, which, given recent events, might not be saying much. Actually, it might be saying everything. Martinez turned away from the monitors, because someone's been working very hard to destroy your credibility. The question is why they're so afraid. Of what you might discover, David's phone buzzed with an alert from his security system. On the monitor, he watched as a familiar figure approached his front door, Captain Rodriguez, but this time he wasn't alone. 2 officers flanked him, their hands resting on their weapons. Looks like we're about to find out, David said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Rodriguez's knock was aggressive, demanding. David could hear the tension in the captain's voice, even through the reinforced door. Mr. Chen, this is Captain Rodriguez. I need to speak with you immediately. Martinez moved toward the rear of the house, her hand instinctively moving to her service weapon. Is there another way out of here? Several, David replied, quickly saving his files to encrypted drives, but running would only validate their narrative. Besides, I want to hear what Rodriguez has to say. David opened the door to find Rodriguez flanked by officers Blake and Morrison, both of whom he recognized from previous community meetings. Their positioning was tactical professional intimidation disguised as official business. Captain Rodriguez. Officers, to what do I owe this early morning visit? We need to talk about your harassment of city officials and interference with ongoing investigations, Rodriguez said, pushing past David into the house. Harassment. I attended a public meeting and asked questions about public safety. Since when is civic engagement considered harassment? Since you started making unfounded accusations against respected members of the community, Rodriguez's eyes swept the room, taking in the computer setup and stacks of documents. And since you began conducting unauthorized surveillance of city employees, unauthorized surveillance. David's voice carried a note of genuine confusion. Captain, I think you're mistaken about the scope of my activities. Are we? Because we have reports that you've been following city workers, photographing their personal vehicles, and accessing confidential financial records. David felt the familiar chill of a carefully constructed trap closing around him. I think you need to be more specific about these allegations, Captain, and I think you need to explain why you're in my home without a warrant. We're conducting a welfare check. Officer Blake interjected, based on reports of erratic behavior and potential threats to public safety. Whose reports? That's not your concern, Rodriguez said, moving deeper into the house. What is your concern is the evidence we've collected suggesting you've been using your technical expertise to conduct illegal surveillance of city employees. From the kitchen, Martinez's voice cut through the tension. Actually, Captain, I think that is his concern. Along with the fact that you failed to mention, I was already here conducting my own investigation. Rodriguez spun around, his face flushing with anger and surprise. Detective Martinez, what are you doing here? Following up on leads in the Willowbrook burglary cases. Leads that Mr. Chen has been very helpful in providing. Martinez stepped into the living room, her presence immediately changing the dynamics. I'm curious, Captain. Why didn't you mention that you were planning to visit Mr. Chen this morning? Because it's not related to your investigation, isn't it? Martinez pulled out her phone, displaying a photo of surveillance footage. Because Mr. Chen's security cameras captured some very interesting activity on Elm Street the night before the Morrison house was burglarized. Activity that includes a vehicle registered to a city employee. The silence that followed was electric. Rodriguez's jaw worked as he processed the implications, while Blake and Morrison exchanged uncertain glances. What kind of activity? Rodriguez asked, his voice carefully controlled, the kind that suggests someone with inside knowledge of police, patrol schedules, and security vulnerabilities was conducting surveillance of potential targets. David said, moving to his computer, the kind that shows a systematic pattern of reconnaissance preceding each burglary. You're manufacturing evidence, Rodriguez said, but his conviction was wavering. Manipulating surveillance footage to support your conspiracy theories. David pulled up the relevant files on his monitor, because I've got metadata, timestamps, and corroborating footage from 3 different camera systems. I've got financial records showing unusual cash deposits into accounts linked to city employees. And I've got communication records showing coordination between individuals who publicly opposed the security gates. Martinez stepped forward, her detective instincts fully engaged. Captain, I think we need to discuss this at the station. There are questions about resource allocation and patrol scheduling that need to be addressed. Detective Martinez, you're overstepping your authority. Actually, she's not. David's voice carried a new authority that made everyone in the room take notice. Because, as of this morning, Detective Martinez has been granted access to all of my security data as part of an official investigation into organized criminal activity in Willowbrook Estates. Rodriguez's face went pale. What investigation? The one that began when I contacted the FBI's Public Corruption Unit last week, David said, enjoying the moment of shocked silence. The one that's been quietly gathering evidence while you've been busy trying to discredit me. Martinez's phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen with a slight smile. Speaking of which, Captain, I think you're going to want to see this. We just received a warrant to search city records related to the Willowbrook security gate removal process. The trap that Rodriguez had walked into was now fully sprung, the desperate man beneath. You have no idea what you've started, Rodriguez said quietly. I have every idea, David replied. I've started the process of restoring safety to a neighborhood that trusted its leaders to protect them. Raid on City Hall began at 10:30 a.m., exactly 3 hours after Rodriguez's confrontation with David Chen. Federal agents swarmed the building. Armed with warrants for financial records, communication logs, and personnel files related to the Willowbrook security gate controversy. By noon, the local news trucks had arrived, transforming the quiet administrative building into the center of a breaking scandal. David watched the coverage from his office, but his attention was focused on the secure phone call he'd been waiting for all morning. Special Agent Rebecca Torres of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit had finally returned his call. Mr. Chen, I want to thank you for your cooperation in this investigation, Torres said, her voice crisp and professional. Your evidence has been instrumental in uncovering what appears to be a systematic pattern of corruption spanning multiple city departments. Agent Torres, I need to know, are the residents of Willowbrook going to be safe? Because every day, this corruption continues, more families are being victimized. That's actually why I'm calling. We've arrested Marcus Walsh, the locksmith, and frozen the accounts of Reliable Security Solutions. We've also detained 2 individuals who were preparing to conduct another burglary tonight. What about Rodriguez and Hayes? Captain Rodriguez is being questioned regarding his role in redirecting patrol routes and suppressing crime statistics. Councilwoman Hayes is cooperating with the investigation, though her brother-in-law's business is under federal scrutiny, and the burglaries. We believe we've identified the core network responsible for both the security system sabotage and the subsequent criminal activity. What's particularly troubling is that this appears to be part of a larger pattern. Similar schemes have been operating in affluent neighborhoods across 3 states. David's blood ran cold. 3 states, your security system and data analysis capabilities uncovered something much bigger than local corruption. Mr. Chen, you've helped us identify an organized criminal network that specifically targets communities with private security systems. They infiltrate local government, dismantle security measures, and then exploit the vulnerability they've created. The implications were staggering. David had thought he was fighting a local conspiracy, but he'd actually stumbled onto a national criminal enterprise. Agent Torres, I need to ask you something directly. How long have you been aware of this network? There was a pause that lasted just a moment too long. Mr. Chen, the Bureau has been tracking various activities that fit this pattern for approximately 18 months. Your case provided the first clear connection between the different incidents. You've been tracking this for 18 months, and you let it continue? We've been building a comprehensive case that would ensure successful prosecution. These networks are sophisticated, Mr. Chen. They understand how to exploit legal loopholes and bureaucratic processes. Rushing to arrest individuals without understanding the full scope of their operations would have resulted in light sentences and the network simply relocating. David understood the logic, but the human cost was harder to accept. So the families in Willowbrook were acceptable collateral damage. The families in Willowbrook are victims, Mr. Chen, but so are the families in 12 other communities where similar schemes have been operating. Your evidence has given us the tools to shut down all of them simultaneously. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at David's door. Through his security monitor, he saw Detective Martinez, but this time she was accompanied by a woman in a federal jacket. Agent Torres, I believe your colleague has just arrived at my house. That would be Agent Sarah Kim from our Cybercrimes Division. She's there to discuss the next phase of the investigation. David opened the door to find Martinez, looking exhausted but satisfied. Mr. Chen, I think you're going to want to hear what Agent Kim has to say. Mr. Chen, your security system has collected evidence that extends far beyond Willowbrook Estates. We've identified communication patterns and financial transactions that connect this local network to similar operations in Georgia, Arizona, and Massachusetts. How extensive is this network? Conservative estimate: 12 major operations, 47 municipal employees, and approximately $200 million in stolen property and fraudulent insurance claims over the past 3 years. David sank into his chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what he'd uncovered. I just wanted to keep my neighborhood safe. You did more than that, Martinez said. Agent Kim pulled out a tablet and showed David a network diagram that looked like a spider web of connections. The individuals in Willowbrook weren't just opportunistic criminals. They were part of a franchise operation, a business model that could be replicated in any affluent community with private security systems. A franchise operation. Think of it as crime as if the network provides local operatives with the tools, training, and support needed to infiltrate municipal governments, dismantle security systems, and exploit the resulting vulnerability. The local operators keep a percentage of the profits, while the network takes the majority and expands to new markets. David studied the diagram, recognizing patterns that mirrored his own analysis of the Willowbrook situation. This is why they were so determined to discredit me. It wasn't just about local corruption, it was about protecting a national operation. Exactly, your technical expertise and security background made you the most dangerous threat they'd encountered. Most communities don't have someone with your capabilities asking the right questions. Martinez leaned forward. Which brings us to our next request, Mr. Chen. The Bureau would like your help in identifying similar patterns in other communities. David looked at the 3 law enforcement officers in his living room, then at the monitors, showing his neighborhood a neighborhood that was finally safe again. What exactly are you asking me to do? We're asking you to help us build a national early warning system for this type of organized crime, Agent Kim said. Communities across the country are vulnerable to these networks. Your expertise could help protect them. For the first time in months, David smiled. Agent Kim, I think that's exactly what I've been trying to do all along. 3 weeks later, David stood in the same community center where he'd been unanimously condemned, watching as residents filed in for another emergency meeting. This time, the atmosphere was markedly different. The federal investigation had revealed the true scope of the corruption that had plagued Willowbrook, and the community was beginning to understand the price of their misplaced trust. Councilwoman Hayes sat in the front row. Captain Rodriguez was facing federal charges, and the police department was under external oversight while new leadership was established. Detective Martinez, now serving as interim police chief, approached the podium with a thick folder of documents. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming tonight. I know many of you have questions about the federal investigation and what it means for our community's future. David remained near the back of the room, content to observe rather than participate. His vindication had been complete, but the satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge of how much suffering could have been prevented if the community had listened to evidence instead of political rhetoric. First, I want to address the elephant in the room, Martinez continued. The security gates that were removed from Willowbrook Estates were not just effective, they were the primary obstacle preventing a criminal network from operating in our community. The decision to remove them was not based on legitimate community concerns, but on a coordinated effort to eliminate barriers to criminal activity. A murmur of discomfort rippled through the crowd. These were the same residents who'd voted unanimously against David's security measures, and the reality of their manipulation was difficult to accept. The federal investigation has revealed that at least 14 individuals, including city employees and elected officials, were involved in a scheme to systematically dismantle security measures in affluent neighborhoods across multiple states. Willowbrook was not unique. We were targeted because our security system was particularly effective. Mrs. Rodriguez from Oak Street raised her hand. Detective Martinez, what about the burglaries? Have they caught everyone involved? We've arrested 12 individuals directly involved in the burglary ring, including the crew that was conducting surveillance and the individuals who were providing inside information about police patrol schedules. We've also recovered approximately 60% of the stolen property. Another resident stood up. What about our security? Are we going to be safe now? Martinez looked toward the back of the room where David was standing. That's actually a question that Mr. Chen is better qualified to answer than I am. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to David. He'd become something of a local celebrity since the federal investigation began, but his relationship with the community remained complicated. He'd been proven right about everything, but the vindication came at the cost of neighbors and friends who'd turned against him. David made his way to the front of the room, accepting the microphone from Martinez. 3 months ago, I stood in this room and tried to explain why security measures were necessary. I was told that I was paranoid, that I was turning our neighborhood into a fortress, that I didn't trust our police or our neighbors. He paused, looking out at faces that now showed shame instead of anger. I want to be clear about something. I was never trying to control this community. I was trying to protect it. The security gates, the cameras, the access controls, they were tools designed to keep all of us safe. Mr. Chen interrupted a voice from the middle of the room. It was Tom Morrison, whose house had been burglarized twice in the past month. I owe you an apology. We all do. But what I want to know is whether you're willing to help us fix this mess. David considered the question carefully. Mr. Morrison, I'm willing to help rebuild the security system, but only if this community is willing to learn from what happened. The greatest threat to our safety wasn't the criminals who broke into your homes. It was the willingness to silence voices that asked uncomfortable questions. What do you mean? Asked another resident. I mean that democratic participation doesn't end with voting. It requires active engagement with evidence, critical thinking about policies, and the courage to challenge authority when it's not serving the public interest. The security gates were just technology. The real security comes from a community that values truth over convenience. Martinez stepped forward. Mr. Chen has agreed to work with the FBI to develop a community security framework that can be implemented nationwide. Willowbrook will be the pilot program for a new approach to neighborhood safety, one that combines advanced technology with community engagement and oversight. David nodded. The new system will be transparent, accountable, and designed to serve the entire community. But it will also be robust enough to detect and prevent the kind of organized criminal activity that targeted us. What about cost? Someone called out. The federal government is providing funding for the pilot program as part of the investigation settlement. Additionally, insurance companies are offering substantial discounts to communities that implement comprehensive security measures. Mrs. Rodriguez raised her hand again. Mr. Chen, I have to ask, are you going to hold what happened against us? Because I know I said some terrible things about you. David's expression softened. Mrs. Rodriguez, we were all manipulated by people who understood how to exploit our fears and prejudices. The important thing is that we learn from this experience and build something better. The meeting continued for another hour, with residents asking detailed questions about the new security system, the federal investigation, and the steps being taken to prevent future corruption. By the end, David found himself surrounded by neighbors who wanted to apologize, express gratitude, or simply shake his hand. As the crowd dispersed, Martinez approached him with a thoughtful expression. How does it feel to be vindicated? David considered the question. It feels like a beginning rather than an ending. We've exposed the corruption, but we haven't addressed the underlying issues that made it possible. What underlying issues? The willingness to accept simple explanations for complex problems, the tendency to attack messengers rather than examine messages, the assumption that people who ask difficult questions must have ulterior motives. Martinez nodded. Think the community has learned its lesson? Some have. Others will need more time to process what happened. But I'm hopeful that we can build something better than what we had before. 6 months after the federal investigation began, David Chen stood before a congressional subcommittee in Washington, D.C., testifying about organized crime networks targeting residential communities. The Willowbrook case had become a model for how federal, state, and local law enforcement could work together to combat sophisticated criminal enterprises. Mr. Chen, said Congressman Bradley, the subcommittee chair, your experience in Willowbrook has led to the identification and prosecution of criminal networks in 12 states. Can you explain to the committee how a single neighborhood security system became the key to unraveling a national conspiracy? David adjusted his microphone and looked out at the packed hearing room. Congressmen, the criminals who targeted Willowbrook, made a critical error. They assumed that removing security measures would eliminate the threat of detection. What they didn't anticipate was that the security system had already collected enough data to identify their methods and patterns, but the system had been disabled. How were you able to continue your investigation? The security gates were removed, but the underlying surveillance network remained intact. Additionally, I had maintained backup systems that the criminals were unaware of. When the burglaries began, I was able to correlate the new criminal activity with the patterns I'd observed. Before the security measures were dismantled, Senator Williams leaned forward. Mr. Chen, some critics have suggested that your methods bordered on vigilantism. How do you respond to concerns about private citizens conducting their own criminal investigations? Senator, I want to be clear about what I did and didn't do. I collected evidence, analyzed patterns, and shared my findings with law enforcement. I didn't take any direct action against suspected criminals, and I didn't interfere with official investigations. What I did was exercise my rights as a citizen to protect my community and seek justice through legal channels. But you had capabilities that most citizens don't possess: advanced technical skills, sophisticated equipment, and apparently some background in intelligence work. Doesn't that give you an unfair advantage? David smiled slightly. Senator, I would argue that it gave me a responsibility. When you have the ability to identify threats to public safety, you have an obligation to act. The question isn't whether I had unfair advantages, whether I used those advantages responsibly. Congressman Bradley consulted his notes. Mr. Chen, you've been working with the FBI to develop what's being called the Community Security Framework. Can you explain how this program addresses the vulnerabilities that these criminal networks exploited? The framework has three main components. First, it provides communities with the tools and training needed to implement effective security measures. Second, it creates channels for information sharing between communities and law enforcement. Third, it establishes oversight mechanisms to prevent the kind of corruption that enabled these networks to operate. And the pilot program in Willowbrook has been remarkably successful. Crime rates have dropped below pre-conspiracy levels. Community engagement has increased significantly, and we've identified and prevented 3 additional attempts by criminal networks to establish operations in the area. Senator Williams looked skeptical. Mr. Chen, aren't you concerned about creating a surveillance state? The security measures you're describing sound quite extensive. Senator, I'm more concerned about creating safe communities. The surveillance capabilities we've implemented are transparent, accountable, and designed to protect privacy while detecting criminal activity. Every system includes oversight mechanisms and regular audits to prevent abuse. But who watches the watchers? Mr. Chen. David paused, considering his response carefully. The community watches the watchers, Senator. That's the fundamental principle of the framework we've developed. Every security measure is subject to community oversight. Every decision about implementation is made through transparent democratic processes. David Chen was testifying before Congress about a new security system he had created to help communities protect themselves from crime. He explained that this system was not just about stopping burglaries, but also about fighting organized crime like fraud, drug dealing, and even terrorism. David's goal was to help communities build strong, secure systems that didn't rely on just a few experts, but could be used by anyone. Anywhere. When asked about the cost of implementing this system, David said that while it might cost money, the cost of not having these security measures was much higher. In his own town, Willowbrook, criminals had stolen millions of dollars and caused a lot of harm. The new system would cost much less and protect communities in many ways. Senator Williams raised an important point about corruption, asking how to stop criminals from infiltrating local governments. David responded that the system included radical transparency, meaning that every decision about security or spending would be open to the public. This would make it harder for corruption to thrive. David explained that law enforcement agencies supported his system because it made their jobs easier. Communities that helped protect themselves made it easier for police to focus on serious crimes. However, some government officials who benefited from the old system had objections, but these were fading as the new system proved successful. David also addressed the issue of whistleblowers, people who expose corruption or crime. His system includes protections for these individuals, like legal support and education for the public to encourage listening to uncomfortable truths. Instead of attacking those who speak out, when asked if he had any regrets, David said he wished he had focused more on educating the community from the start. He had spent too much time on the technical side and not enough on helping people understand the importance of security and transparency. David's message to communities across the country was clear. Don't wait for someone else to protect you. Don't trust that all government officials are acting in your best interest. And don't let anyone convince you that questioning things is wrong. If people face resistance, they should remember that those who oppose transparency often have something to hide. After the hearing, David spoke with Chief Martinez from Willowbrook, who had traveled to attend. David felt proud of the progress his community had made, but knew that the work wasn't done. He planned to help other communities implement the security system and eventually create a nationwide network of safe, informed communities that could fight organized crime together. Looking ahead, David was determined to keep expanding the system, including protections against cybercrime and financial fraud. He believed that with enough dedication, communities could protect themselves from criminals and hold corrupt officials accountable. David's journey showed that ordinary citizens, if they stand up for what's right, can make a huge difference. His greatest achievement wasn't just the technology he developed, but the way he helped communities become resilient and secure.